This conference will now be
15 people or
recorded.
so, I think.
Very good.
Okay, so well, since this is a lunch hour, I think we could probably begin kind of going through this. Thanks everybody for joining. This is a part of our APA Cleveland kind of lunch series talks. We've got quite a few scheduled for the summer, usually followed by some in-person event as well. This will be followed by a Thursday hike with some of the staff who are on the call. But I'll let them introduce themselves, and then we can get started for the presentation. We can talk a little bit about the hike and tour and happy hour afterwards. Ivan, the floor is all yours.
Terrific. Well, thanks for joining, everyone. My name is Ivan Kasovic, and I've been with the National Park Service about 30 years, mostly out west in parks like Zion, Grand Canyon, and Rocky Mountain. But for the last 10 years, I've been the Deputy Chief Ranger here at Cuyahoga Valley, and currently I'm serving a detail in the Superintendent's office working on projects and community outreach, mostly to government and planning agencies. As part of that, I've been involved not only in our community access plan here at the park, but also with the Cuyahoga Greenways plan and also trail planning efforts in Summit County and down south. And I'll just be doing the introduction today, and then I'll also be joining you on Thursday for the walk around. But I'd like to introduce our other participants from the National Park Service today. The first is Jenny Vassarelli.
Yep. Hi, everyone. Jenny Vassarelli. I'm also based here at Cuyahoga Valley National Park. My job is leading the Division of Interpretation, Education, and Visitor Services, which is really about how we engage the public in the park. But I've also been the point of contact facilitating our community access plan for Cuyahoga Valley National Park, which is the topic for today.
And we've also got Maureen Finnerty joining us from Denver.
Yeah, thanks so much, Ivan. My name is Maureen Finnerty. I'm a project manager with the Visitor Use Management and Socioeconomics team at the Denver Service Center Planning Branch, which is a branch of the National Park Service, our Washington support office. We are based here in Denver, but I used to be based right there at Cuyahoga Valley with these fine people. I worked at the park for 5 years before coming to Denver. So I'm really excited to continue work on the community access plan, which started while I was there.
Great. Well, let's see if we can get this thing to move. We've met everybody, and we'll talk a little bit today about a little bit of context, the background of the park and what we're supposed to be doing here. And then Maureen is going to fill us in on the methodology of how these community access plans they're known throughout the Park Service, visitor use management plans are put together and how they're and how they fit into each park. And then Jenny's going to help us out by touching on some of the specifics of what we're working on here and sort of set the stage for what we'll see on Thursday. But by way of introduction to Cuyahoga Valley, let's go back in time a little bit and talk about how we got to where we are. And so This park is all about the urban context. And we're 33,000 acres wedged between the two urban centers of Cleveland and Akron. You know, the park boundary is right there at Rockside Road and stretches south all the way down into Merriman Valley. And the history of how we got here is really interesting. You know, the valley has really been, in our modern post settlement times, has really been defined as a place for outdoor experiences for more than a century. You know, as the two cities industrialized after the Civil War, lots of people, especially new immigrants, really focused on the valley as a place to access the outdoors and those same sort of pastoral experiences that they were familiar with, either from the European setting or when we're talking about African American resettlement, from contexts elsewhere in the country. But in either case, people found their way here, and by the turn of the 20th century, people were going on all kinds of excursions into the valley by canal boat and then by railroad, and really digging into those outdoor experiences that you just didn't get in Cleveland and Akron. Of course, by that time, the city of Cleveland was already thinking about outdoor space and how to provide for the same sort of thing within the urban context. And it was really, you know, the Olmsted brothers that got out here sort of in those early consulting days and took a look at everything. You know, they really stressed the importance of scenic views and the pastoral landscape idea. And parks were sort of thought of as being distanced from the urban setting, and something that you would travel to. So even in those days, it wasn't so much as embedding it into everyday life as it was providing an excursion, especially when we're talking about the Cuyahoga Valley, more of an excursion-based experience to go and view the landscape. So that's sort of where we got anchored. And you know, they took a look at both Cleveland, and they also did work down south, looking at Akron. And in those early reports, you know, they envisioned, even in the 20s, envisioned the valley being a connector between the two. And you know, it said it was an impressive beauty, and it was, you know, hard to imagine this not being incorporated at some point. So, you know, from the development of the Cleveland Metro Parks and later some Metro Parks, from those early days, the valley was seen as sort of an extension of what was already being built. And it wasn't just for the scenery, it also became sort of a place for organized recreation. And parts of the history of the valley that we don't always hit on is that by the 30s, people were really accessing the area and using it for youth camps, was a big part of it. And more recently, you know, we've uncovered some of the history of social clubs for the African American communities in Akron that would come up and sort of have build and create the same sort of social opportunities that they were familiar with from other parts of the country. And then, of course, we have the history of the CCC and the development of some of the parklands happening in the 30s as well. And so that was sort of the early context. Now, when we talk about the modern history of the park, we oftentimes focus on the grassroots efforts to establish the national park itself. And rather than being sort of an all-at-once effort, it really was fits and starts. And there was both the grassroots effort amongst local communities, as well as the growing interest from Congressman Cyberling and Regula. And that eventually led to the establishment of the park in '74. But when you talk to folks in, for example, in Boston Township, where they really got started with the idea of conservation was with their opposition to 271 crossing the valley. They really saw that as something that broke up their community, you know, going right across the top of, basically, right across the top of the township, and breaking everything up. And it was from some of those early organizing efforts that that some of the efforts to establish a larger conservation area grew, as well as from other groups as well. So that by the time that we were looking at the hardcore suburbanization post World War II, and the growth of the suburban communities through white flight and disinvestment, this is where the ideas really gelled, and the political will was really flexed, and we arrived at the legislation in 1974 that would actually establish the park. They got it in front of President Ford while he was out in Vails on a ski holiday, and it was described as him as, if you want to lose Ohio in the election, go ahead and don't sign this. So despite opposition from the National Park Service, President Ford signed it, then strapped on the boards and got back out on the slopes and hit the back bowls for a while. So that's how we came to be, and it was really through the vision of a lot of folks, and the support that we received persisted well beyond just the establishment. Congressman Cyberling and Regula, particularly Congressman Regula, continued to be sort of a guiding force in the development of the park as well. And so we became one of the Parks to the People parks. And, that was part of a movement in the 70s that recognized that with what was happening in the urban areas, that we needed to expand the national park idea, that the folks in the cities that were likely never going to get to Denali. They were never going to experience some of the wonders of Yellowstone or Grand Teton or Yosemite, and that we needed to provide for these same kinds of experiences to people who were stuck in Cleveland or Akron, or the other places where we saw those parks develop was outside New York City with Gateway National Recreation Area, as well as out in San Francisco with Golden Gate National Recreation Area. Of course, we ourselves were an NRA until 2000, when we were renamed. Speaking of which, the name didn't really change anything in our purpose. It just changed the name. So when we talk about what we're supposed to be doing here, what we're supposed to be providing, we reflect back to that enabling legislation that Congress put out for Ford to sign, and it was really about protecting the values of the valley, and also specifically calling out the Cuyahoga River and the adjacent lands. Now we've just are wrapping up a 5-year strategic plan that focused on capitalizing on the cleanup of the water in the river and expanding recreational opportunities there, and something we'll be talking about in a little bit here. But the other thing that it called out, which is sort of special for us, is the legislation really called out the needed recreational open space necessary for the urban environment, as well as meeting the recreational and educational needs of the visiting public. And that's something that we really hold dear, that we really have been instructed to provide not just the recreational opportunities, but also education. And that's one of the reasons that, despite lots of challenges, we remain dedicated to that focus, both at the Environmental Education Center as well as through the programming and a lot of other stuff that we do. So that's what we were intended to do. That's what we try and hit on. The public, of course, experiences the park the way they want to. And most of our visitation is recreational visitation. And it's really coalesced around a few different core experiences. The development of the towpath trail, which happened, daylighting the trail was, we were going to do, it was suggested we do a mile or two to bring back the canal and the towpath. And John Debo, our longtime superintendent, said, heck with that, let's do the whole park. And wildly popular. I mean, the stories of people riding their bikes right up to where the bulldozers were working are legend now. And of course, now we're looking at completion of the towpath. Also the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad, you know, a hobby railroad trying to recreate that rail experience that people had, and now carrying 250,000 visitors a year. So that's another big one. And then of course the Canalway, which stretches all the way up and down New Philadelphia, all the way up to Canal Basin. And our trail network, 120 miles of hiking trail. And now of course, the East Rim Trail, the premier machine-built flow trail for mountain biking in Northeast Ohio, a real complement to the rest of the trail system. And so that's where we find ourselves. You know, we sort of had visitation growing and growing and growing in this urban national park. And as we got bigger and more popular, we've seen more and more calls for community connections, like the Independence Trail Project that brought the trail down from the city of Independence down to the towpath to connect. And we see more efforts like that happening up and down the towpath, and we welcome those, of course, as well as the development of the Cuyahoga River Water Trail on the designation just a couple of years ago, where we now have a whole trail with maps and mileposts and put-ins and takeouts, and just an explosion of kayaking on the Cuyahoga River. It's just been phenomenal. So we really are in a place of looking at a far different recreational pattern than we looked at just a few years ago. When I got here a decade ago, you know, our advice to the visiting public about the Cuyahoga River was view it from a distance, and for God's sake, don't get any on your skin. And we have come a really long way since then. So we celebrate that, but it's also, you know, we've grown in popularity. It's brought some challenges. The programming has been popular beyond our wildest expectations. Kids that went through those environmental education camps, you know, 20 years ago are now working at the EEC, and they're bringing their families back to the park. And we've looked at a really phenomenal growth in visitation. We're averaging 2.5 million a year, and and that's a lot. We saw during the early days of COVID, just based on Google mobility data, about 150% increase over baseline, and on weekends about 300% increase over baseline. And that really did affect us. It really got our attention. We had already started this this community access plan effort to address what we'd seen as being, you know, increasing challenges, especially when it comes to those peak flow times. The overflow that happens in the national park is unlike the overflow that happens at a Zion, or a Yosemite, or a Yellowstone. We don't overflow within our own boundaries under our own road shoulders. When we overflow on the weekends, we're overflowing into communities. So we're on people's private property. We get calls from townships and villages about the parking issues and what are we doing about it, and why aren't there more rangers out writing tickets and towing cars, etc. And so we feel it a little bit more keenly, and we feel it perhaps more keenly than the metro parks in some ways, for the same reason that we don't own the roadways or the shoulders. Which is sort of a unique aspect of management here. So that's why we dove into this. That's one of the main reasons we dove into this this community access planning process, but also because we just see the development of the park and the way that we connect to communities as being some unfinished business. Celebrating our 50th anniversary in 2024. That sounds old, but development-wise, it's not quite finished. It's an unfinished piece of business. So this plan is what's going to bring us into the next 50 years. And to explain how that works, I'm going to turn it over to Maureen. And when you need a slide advance, Maureen, just give me a shout.
Great, thanks, Ivan. We'll do. Go ahead and yeah, great. Thanks. So fortunately, all the stuff that Ivan mentioned, the growth in use and development in the park, is not unique to Cuyahoga. As Ivan said, there are certainly some unique elements that apply to Cuyahoga Valley and its surrounding communities. Fortunately, though, there has been a working group, not only in the National Park Service, but across agencies in the federal land management sphere, working on these issues in national parks, Forest Service lands, Bureau of Land Management, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the other applications to try to help folks address some of these challenges in a way that doesn't just say shut the gates, right? Like that is not where we want to go in terms of not only our relationship with our communities, but in terms of how we effectively provide for visitor experience in our parks and protected areas. So this through this planning process, we followed the visitor use management framework. We are talking about visitor use management in terms of this framework. You'll notice there's a different title on this plan. It's the Community Access Plan, and that is certainly a testament to some of the things Ivan was talking about. This plan is really a lot about the park and its relationship with its communities on a broader scale across federal agencies. We do talk about this in terms of visitor use management. So you'll hear me use that phrase. That's really referring to this framework that we use to help parks and land managers address visitor use challenges as well as opportunities. So this process has been developed over the years by subject matter experts, federal land management agencies, and with input from park staff, advisory committees, and of course, we got some lawyers involved. We talked to the solicitor's office as well to make sure everything we did met our statutory requirements and followed policy guidance. So this process has also been used internationally. In our visitor use management office has worked with governments of Brazil and Palau, as well as at state and regional levels. We've worked with the California state parks as well as several others. So although this was developed by the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council, which is a group of federal land management partners, it is certainly applicable across many different applications in different land management entities. So we're going to go through the steps of this framework, and then later on in the presentation, Jenny's going to talk to you more specifically about how it applies to Cuyahoga Valley National Park. So one thing about this framework is that it's made to be proactive and adaptive to manage the characteristics of visitor use and natural and cultural resources within the park setting. It's meant to use a variety of tools and strategies to achieve desired conditions. I'm going to talk in more detail about desired conditions a little bit later in the presentation. So as Ivan mentioned, the park started working on this, oh gosh, quite a few years ago, while I was still in the park, working on kind of building that foundation and beginning this process, gathering information, and really starting to identify what the key challenges and opportunities at Cuyahoga were. And so we're gonna talk more about that specific process as we move on. But I want to talk a little bit next about some of the advantages of using this framework. So next slide, Ivan. Great. So visitor use planning has an official definition. I'm going to read this because I won't remember all of it, but visitor use planning is the dynamic process of planning for and managing characteristics of visitor use and the setting through a variety of strategies and tools. For example, education, site management, regulation, enforcement, rationing, allocation, to sustain or maintain desired conditions and visitor experiences. So the short version of that is visitor use planning is management of people and resources while sustaining both. So this framework is all about providing high quality visitor experiences while protecting resources and achieving and maintaining those desired conditions. If you think about why people visit protected areas, people come to these places for many, many reasons. For many people, it's a place to connect with their natural and cultural heritage, to pursue healthy lifestyles. I even talked about the towpath, the explosion of recreation on the river. These are folks doing all of those things. They want to spend time with family and friends. We have lots of data around the value of the people that you're with, that matters more to many visitors than actually where they're going. So that connection with family and friends, and having a space that welcomes you to be able to do that. These spaces contribute to the economy and vitality of their local communities, and they also inspire many of us, certainly those of us that work in these places and choose this as a career and also a place to enjoy with our family and friends. These places also, and these can enhance the public's experiences and allow for people to kind of garner support for resources, and in some cases develop attitudes where they might want to conserve or care for these places, leading to stewardship. So it's important that we balance those experiences. This is why we don't just shut the gate, right? Because these are valuable experiences for people to come to these places and connect with these resources. And that's why visitor use planning is so critical. So we know that visitor use can vary by levels of use, timing, distribution of use and activities, and behaviors. We know that the visitor use planning can also include a variety of approaches to help manage that use. So we think about visitor use impacts and to the resources varying depending on many factors, right? So the numbers of people, the use patterns, when are they coming, how often are they coming, the activities that they engage in. Each activity that you engage in has different impacts to the resources as well as to other visitors. And we also think about, when we manage visitor use, we think about the resource type and the resiliency of those resources. An example of this is, people walking on the alpine tundra, if they destroy that vegetation, it can take, years and years and years to regenerate. Whereas in an environment like Cuyahoga, if they're walking in a riparian area which frequently floods, that environment can be somewhat more resilient depending on exactly the resources that you're dealing with. So the details matter, but those are the types of things that we consider when we develop our strategies for managing visitor use. So sometimes we find that very little use, like in the tundra example, can cause a lot of impacts. And sometimes a lot of use can cause very little impacts, depending on not only the resource, but also the design, site design and interventions that we make to help create more resiliency in that resource. So we also think about the need for multiple strategies to protect resources and visitor experiences. So today we're going to go into the details of the framework that help us balance that need for high quality visitor experiences and resource protection. Next slide. Okay, presentation wouldn't be complete without a few more definitions, but I want to point out that visitor use is different than visitor experience. So we think about visitor use as the presence of humans in an area for recreational purposes. And then visitor experience is really the perceptions, feelings, and reactions that a visitor has before trip planning, during the trip, and then after. So those memories, those things that you take home with you. Now that doesn't mean that we don't manage for both. We absolutely do, but there's kind of differences in those two terms. Next slide. So what are some of the reasons that we manage for visitor use? Visitor use management helps park managers expand visitor opportunities. A lot of people, when we say visitor use management, they immediately think about limiting visitor use, or that close the gate example, right? But the real purpose of why we do this work is to expand those visitor opportunities. We also think about the appropriateness of new visitor activities. And when we say that, we think about the impacts to the resource, not our personal feelings about whether or not something is appropriate, but there's a lot of information that comes into this, not only the resource condition, but also public engagement, right? What do our visitors want and need, and where else are those opportunities being provided near the park or the resource? So we assess that when we think about appropriateness. We also want to enhance the opportunities for those key visitor experiences in the park. Here's a big one that we think about: aligning public expectations with visitor opportunities. So a lot of folks are more than happy to go to a crowded place if they know ahead of time it's going to be crowded. A lot of folks are more than happy to plan their trip differently if they know they know ahead of time what their options are. So aligning those public expectations. We want to avoid or minimize impacts caused by visitor use to resources. It's not possible in all resources, but certainly in some of our more sensitive resources, we want to be able to mitigate some of those impacts. We also want to think about conflicts between user groups and with wildlife. So how we manage our trail systems, our parking lots, those sorts of things. And then we want to balance trade-offs between management strategies. And we'll talk more about management strategies in a little bit. Next slide, Ivan. So I mentioned the where all of this guidance came from, just a little bit of background on the Interagency Visitor Use Management Council. So this council was formed in 2011 to provide guidance on long-term visitor use management policies and give direction on the most pressing needs by building technical competencies and improving interagency coordination. So this framework consists of, it provides consistent guidance across all agencies. It elevates professional and scientific approach to managing visitor use. It increases communication and collaboration so we can learn from one another in the field of visitor use management. We've seen cost savings and improved efficiency by working collaboratively on some of these shared issues. And I mentioned we talked to the solicitor about all of the things in this visitor use management framework. It provides some more defensible decision making. There's lots of science and data driven decisions being made. So it makes all of those decisions a little bit more defensible. There are many resources available to you at you can see the website visitorusemanagement.nps.gov. And as I said before, those have been used by a number of agencies outside of the federal government, so feel free. That's a public-facing website. On there, you'll find position papers on visitor use management, visitor capacity. You'll find many helpful guidebooks, which I actually started using when I was at Cuyahoga. That's how this process got started. I found one of their guidebooks on the internet, so they are usable, easy to follow, relatively speaking. If you're interested in that type of thing. But all of that is available on the council website that guides the visitor use management framework. Next slide, Ivan. So there's 4 elements that make up the framework. Build the foundation, define visitor use management direction, and implement and identify management strategies, and then implement, monitor, and adjust. So we are going to go through each one of those steps. But before we even start the framework, we need to think about the scale and complexity of the project that we are engaging in. So next slide, Ivan. So the very, very first step before we go into those 4 elements of the framework is to use the sliding scale of analysis. None of us has extra time to just throw away. So the sliding scale of analysis helps us determine the level of uncertainty, the risks to the resources and the visitor experience, and to determine the level of stakeholder interest or the level of controversy in the issue. So this just helps us put the right amount of effort into the process. Next slide. Next slide, Ivan. Might be
There's a little lag. Sorry.
Yep, thanks so much. Okay, and you can just keep going to the next slide. So the first step is build the foundation, element 1. And this one is really pretty straightforward. This is to clarify your project's purpose and need. How many times have you started working on an issue and you find out when you dig in a little bit deeper that it's the core issue might actually be something else? So dig into the purpose and need, review your legislation, anything that you need to help build your project, and then develop your project action plan. And you can skip ahead to Ivan. To element 2, which is to define the visitor use management direction. So this is really the meat of the plan. This is what we actually just finished developing for the community access plan. This is really about defining desired conditions for the project area and defining appropriate visitor activities, facilities, and services, and selecting indicators and establishing thresholds. So really, this sets your vision for your project area. Where do you want to be in the next 5 years, 10 years, 15 years? What are the desired conditions? Next slide. So just a little bit more about desired conditions. They provide a picture of where we want this place to be in the future. So it includes the resources, visitor experiences, and facilities that provide for those experiences. And this helps really give the background for the visitor use management direction. Following your desired conditions, we typically recommend developing indicators and thresholds. These are just really the metrics that help you understand whether or not you're achieving those desired conditions. And so those metrics are things that you commit to monitoring over time to know if progress is being made or if the interventions that you're taking are actually working. Next slide. So the third element of the visitor use management framework, once we've built the foundation, defined our vision, our management direction, is to identify management strategies. Next slide. And this is where you really figure out how you're going to solve some of these issues or leverage some of these opportunities. So we think about where we are now and what the difference between where we are now and our desired conditions are. So, and then we think about what we need to do to achieve those desired conditions. So we identify various strategies to maintain or achieve those desired conditions. In addition to this, we also may identify a monitoring strategy to determine whether or not we're achieving those desired conditions, and in some cases, visitor capacity. So how many people can this area sustain? Next slide. So just really briefly, there's three primary categories of strategies that we can employ. They fall into the categories of education, engineering, actually changes to the site, or enforcement, which are typically our regulatory pieces. So if you think about education, those are your signs, your programming, your flyers, your website, all that falls under that category. Your engineering or your boardwalks, your fences, physically changing the environment to provide for visitor use. And then your regulatory issues tend to be, you could have actual regulations as well as things like permits or registrations or those sorts of things. Next slide. I'm going to touch really briefly on visitor capacity. I know at our local parks we see signs that say things like entrance is not guaranteed when parks are full. There are a way the Park Service doesn't really determine when parks are full, but we do set visitor capacity, and visitor capacity is just a tool to manage to desired conditions. It is a number, and that number is the maximum amount of use that can be accommodated in an area. And it is not about, most of the visitor capacities that we set are actually above and beyond what the current use levels are, but it's really about making sure that we provide those high quality experiences while protecting resources. And then the last element of the visitor use management framework, you got skip 2 slides, Ivan, is this implement, monitor, evaluate, and adjust. This framework is super iterative. So you implement your management actions, you look at your indicators and thresholds, you monitor those and evaluate the effectiveness. Are our interventions helping us achieve our desired conditions? And then we adjust. And if things aren't working, we reassess. Or maybe the indicators that we selected maybe aren't the right ones. We go back in and we look at those indicators. So all of this is a learning process. And that's, I think, the best thing about the framework. It's flexible, it's adaptable, it's adaptive. You can learn from what you're doing and move forward in a different way, or maybe you nailed it the first time and everything you're doing is going the right direction, and then you just continue with that effort. So that was a whirlwind tour of the visitor use management framework. You can become more acquainted with this on the website, which I will drop into the chat. But I want to pass it over to Jenny to talk more specifically about how this was applied to the community access plan.
Great, thank you, Maureen. And I hope a lot of what I'm saying is going to sound familiar. It's going to be how we applied that framework locally. I will say we used a different name. We're using Community Access Plan. We're very interested in kind of thinking about access, thinking about how this park is integrated into the community. we were afraid that the language of visitor use management maybe sent a message of no visitors or something to be managed. So perhaps it wasn't as friendly as a tone. So really the title reflects our commitment to deeply engaging visitors in the community in the park. Next slide. And I'm just going to do kind of a run through of the process and where we are now. We started with internal scoping. For us, internal means both the MPS staff and our operating partner. And we essentially did an internal analysis of the issues and opportunities that built the case for funding the plan. The way Park Service funding works is each park has an operating budget, but we compete for soft funds with other parks. So we needed, to demonstrate a need. We did, and the next slide really shows the issues that we have organized the plan around. For us, a lot does relate to crowding. So it's wayfinding, circulation, and visitor information. It's congestion and concentrated use, and then the impacts of visitation on natural and cultural resources. So that's the problem-solving side of the plan. The next slide also shows opportunities that we were paying attention to. Camping, we have a lot of public interest in camping, improving our relationships with partners and communities, engaging people in the park through commercial and special park uses, thinking very carefully about inclusive access and experiences, including a focus on accessibility, kind of responding. That's a nationwide focus of the National Park Service that we've carried into this plan. And then with the growing role of the Cuyahoga River in recreation, we're specifically focusing on the access points. We're going to do a different plan to address the on-river experiences. So that got us started. The next step, going to the next slide, is civic engagement. We wanted to hear, go to the next slide, please, what the public thought we should be considering. So we did a real front-loaded civic engagement, which is not necessarily typical of these plans, but we wanted a strong community voice. We wanted to open our mind, question our assumptions, and shift our perspectives. Next slide. It was, again, kind of, let's just skip to the next slide in the interest of time, rather than going into details. It was during the pandemic, so we heavily relied on virtual meetings and using a story map for people to explore the park issues and opportunities on their own. We also rely on the Park Service does have a formal planning website called PEPC. It's a planning, environment, and public comment website. Next slide. One of the nice things about virtual meetings is that we could hold meetings with different interest groups so that the people in the virtual room could have a conversation and build on the ideas shared with each other. So we held 10 meetings, and you can see from here again, we focused on different types of interest groups, from tribal communities to community stakeholders, serving minority, disability, and LGBTQ+ communities. Next slide. It worked really well for us. We had really great attendance and received over 1,600 comments. In addition, in each of the meetings, we were really listening to the conversations for the big ideas that we also carried forward into creating the plan. Next slide. The themes were really interesting. They did match in some ways what we were thinking. High interest in camping. I think maybe not so much on our list, but it did come out as a very high interest in trail improvements and access. A very strong interest in in thinking carefully about who's providing commercial services, just very broad interests and diverse visitor experiences in the park. I think one of the key things that came out was our municipalities and stakeholders are willing partners. They both see opportunities for themselves, and some of the issues that we face, also affect them. So we have a lot of shared interest. Next slide. So next slide. Now we've been working on the pieces and parts of the plan. One of the things that we did is we zoned the park into 4 different types of zones, and it's a bit of a patchwork of the zones. And for each zone type, we identified future desired conditions around visitor experience, natural resources, cultural resources, and facilities. One of the zone types is called the high value experience zone. That's where we tend to have high visitation and high quality park resources come together. We have the river corridor where people experience the river, on the river or on the towpath trail or scenic railroad, where we have that multimodal experience. We have the natural zone where people experience quieter, less crowding. The focus is on natural resources. And then we have sensitive resource zone, where the high quality of sensitive natural resources causes us to do things to be more limiting and careful about visitation. All of this is about to be released to the public for you all to be able to see the details. I realize in here, this is really just a teaser. So Ivan, you can skip the next slide and go on to the next one. But this is a really key piece. We worked on indicators and thresholds, as Maureen mentioned. This plan is really about adaptive management. How do we know what's happening related to visitation? The indicators and thresholds, next slide, give us a real systematic way to monitor. So we've identified a few related, to resource condition. A lot are trail related because it's the spillover from trails that can have impact. Next slide. We also are focusing on things that help us understand the quality of the visitor experience. We've tended to focus on people per viewscape. How many people are sharing a space, and is there a point where it's too many that it degrades the visitor experience and we need to take action? Next slide. We can skip the slide too, in interest of time. I'm just trying to provide a sampling of what we're doing and not all the details. We did do a visitor capacity analysis, basically by geographic zone, where we discussed, can this area absorb more visitation without changing the experience? Do we need to focus on trying to reduce visitation to some areas by spreading people to other locations? And then where are we trying to maintain? So a lot, it was just a geographic walkthrough that helped us think about management actions related to very place-based high visitation use. Next slide. And then strategies and actions. This is the fun part. What are we going to do to really refresh and keep the visitor experience here in this park relevant? There's many in here. This sampling is just a few to give you a sense of the scope and scale of them. This isn't an implementation plan. It's really kind of a programmatic plan, but addressing things like exactly where are the river access, what facilities they should include, what should we do to match parking to current and future needs, given the parking evolved when the park had different types of uses. Working on trail connectivity, working on accessibility, and commercial services. We got a bit more specific by focusing them on bicycles, boats, and other recreational equipment. but it's still pretty high level strategies. Next slide. So the plan is getting ready for civic engagement. We are going to have a 60-day public comment period. You know, we're doing it this long because public comment is really important to us. It starts on mid-July. We will be having public meetings online in the park and in Akron and Cleveland during that first week of civic engagement. We'll also be doing pop-up engagement with the public in the parks and communities. We'll make sure all of you get the specifics about the public comment opportunities, because we would really love to see you bring your planning perspectives and your personal outdoor recreation perspectives to the process. Next slide. After we finish public comment, we'll finalize the plan. Then we will do a NEPA related analysis. It might be a follow-up environmental assessment. That's what we're predicting right now. For those of you who are familiar with the National Environmental Protection Act, we're doing the planning first and then following up with an EA, which sets the stage for implementation. That should be all completed by next summer. Next slide. You know, so just this is all about helping this park head into its 50th anniversary with a vision to help prepare the park for the next 50 years of being a really meaningful place, both to individuals and the community. And we really look forward to hearing from all of you about this plan. So this seems like a good time to open the floor to questions or comments. I should mention, unless you want to, Ivan, talk about the walkthrough on Thursday, where we can look at how some of these issues play out in one specific location in the park.
Yeah, that's right. That's basically it, Jenny. We'll be meeting in Boston, right there at the visitor center, and doing a walk around and sort of talking about how this planning effort is going to be, how it interfaces with the actual visitation that we see in the park. And then, as I understand, y'all are going to head over to the Lizard, and actually Peninsula, and that area, Lock 29, is in some ways an even better example of the interaction, because you're right there in the commercial center as well. So two good spots to talk about the next 50 years. And Jenny will be joining us for the walk around as well.
Excellent.
I saw
Thanks
one.
for the, oh yeah, if you
I was
see
just
that
going to
question in
comment on
chat.
the questions in the chat. Ivan, this first question looks like one that might be for you. Is there any discussion of using the rail line through the park to restore passenger rail service between Akron and downtown Cleveland?
Yes, good question. So, we consider the Cuyahoga Valley Scenic Railroad as our alternative transportation system in the park. As an example of how, the bike aboard program is hugely successful. I forget what their numbers are, but let's talk about kayaking. The wonderful thing about kayaking is you get to bring two cars, right? It's a big pain to do a shuttle. So without advertising it at all, people are using the train to do their shuttles for kayak trips. And in 2020 paddling season, they moved about 150 boats, which we thought was like, holy cow, that's huge. Summer 2021, they moved 950 boats. So a 1-year increase. Now think about the possibilities of being able to extend that up to Cleveland. So that's what we're looking at right now. We've actually got a project in to do initial feasibility to extend the rail service to Cleveland. We did this already. We did it in 2008 and identified the main hurdles, which is that, we don't own the tracks. CSX owns the tracks, and we do own the first 2 miles north. So if you go from Rockside up to about Granger Road, we own that 2 miles, and then the remaining 8 belong to CSX. why would a freight company ever want to assume the liability of having passenger rail go across their tracks? They wouldn't. They never would. So we need to figure out a way to make that happen. And so we'll be doing feasibility first, and then going from there. There are so many aspects of the bipartisan infrastructure law that encourage us to seek alternative transportation connections to underserved communities like this one that we've got right here, that we're not gonna miss that opportunity.
Coming up on the hour, but if anybody has any other questions, please feel free to shout them out.
Okay, so I have a set for 4.
I do have one about the, maybe this is for you, Jenny, about kind of like the relationship with the national offices of MPS. You know, how do they, Ivan mentioned kind of when the park was being advocated for a national rec area, that MPS was against that actual creation. Like, is there a lot of tension with MPS on the conservation of the land, or kind of how this park sits in an urban setting, more or less? Or like, does that affect kind of funding streams, or how does that relationship work sometimes?
Yeah, I'll answer that and then let Ivan add in. You know, I think that the negative view of this park being too expensive for the National Park Service to take on really just happened during the evaluation period. You know, but the Park Service doesn't get to make the decision about new parks. New parks are either authorized by presidential proclamation or through an act of Congress. So the MPS is recommending. Now that we are a national park, we work really well with our regional and national offices. A lot of what they do is manage policy and help us make, you know, more complex decisions. They also manage soft money or soft funding, you know, which supports projects and initiatives in this park. You know, I think right now the National Park Service realizes how important it is that we have national parks in urban settings, and that, you know, we stand out as this really special place that shows the potential for both preservation and public use that we can offer in an urban setting. So I think we're actually very well embraced rather than having tension. Ivan, anything you want to add?
No, I would just echo that. The history has been interesting because the development of the park to a large degree for a long time depended on you know, what we used to call pork barrel politics. We got a lot of line item money from the delegation, and we're very well supported by the delegation with line item money and soft money. And you know, when that dried up at the end of that era, which is now coming back in a different way, that kind of stopped a lot of the progress of things like you know, development of trailhead parking at the right scale. It stopped development of providing the infrastructure and the trail system that we sort of knew we needed. And now we're getting back in the business of creating those opportunities for the public, and doing it in a way that's planned, that's thoughtful, and that's sustainable. So perhaps it's best that it happened this way, because I don't think we would have had the same sort of robust planning effort had we done it 20 years ago, or continued it over the last 20 years. So we're in the right place now, that's for sure.
Great to hear. Now we're at the hour here, so just wanted to wrap it up and say thank you to our presenters for sure for spending time with us today. Thank you for everybody who joined. Again, this is my name is Adam Davenport. I'm part of the APA Cleveland board here, hosting a lot of educational events like this. If you did register for the Thursday walk, and happy hour. I'll be sending an email out Wednesday with some specific details for that, just to make sure everybody gets to the right place at the right time. But thank you again for joining us today.
Thanks, everyone.
Take care.
See you Thursday.
See you Thursday.
Bye-bye.